This is the shocking case of the Riverside Murder, where a simple dinner between Rebecca Mills and Thomas Gray turned into a bloody nightmare in front of dozens of witnesses. On that night, as laughter filled the Riverside Grill, a silent figure named Daniel Reed waited patiently, only to unleash chaos that no one could forget. Stay with me as we break down every chilling detail of how a night of celebration became one of the most horrifying crimes the city has ever seen. If you love true crime stories, make sure to support the channel by staying active, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss any of these unbelievable cases. The Riverside Grill had a reputation for being one of the most charming places in the city. Sitting on the edge of the river, its large glass windows gave diners a clear view of the water glittering under the night sky. Inside, the soft sound of live jazz mixed with the hum of cheerful conversations, and the smell of freshly cooked steak and seafood filled the air. Couples leaned close across Camelot tables. Families laughed as children tried to sneak extra desserts, and groups of friends clinked glasses to toast the weekend. It was a place that promised comfort, celebration, and safety. On this particular Saturday evening, every table was booked. Waiters rushed back and forth carrying trays of sizzling plates, their shoes clicking against the polished wooden floor. The atmosphere was lively, but it had a relaxed rhythm, the kind of rhythm that made people forget about their worries for a few hours. Nobody in the room had the slightest idea that the night would soon take a turn so dark it would never be forgotten. Among the many guests was Thomas Gray. He entered wearing a tailored suit, polished shoes, and an expression of confidence. His presence was calm yet commanding, and the staff guided him to a carefully reserved table by the window. It looked like the beginning of another ordinary evening, another night, when the Riverside Grill would live up to its reputation for joy and elegance. But hidden in the crowd was a silent threat, one that no one noticed, one that waited for the perfect moment to destroy the illusion of safety that filled the room. Rebecca Mills arrived not long after Thomas had taken his seat. The door opened and she stepped inside, with the kind of presence that immediately drew eyes. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her hair styled neatly, and a quiet air of confidence surrounded her. Unlike Thomas, who carried himself with reserved authority, Rebecca had a warmth that made her approachable. The hostess guided her to the table by the window where Thomas waited, and the two greeted each other with polite smiles that suggested familiarity, but not intimacy. To most onlookers, they could have been mistaken for a couple. Yet in reality, their connection was built on business. Rebecca was a successful entrepreneur who had recently achieved a major breakthrough. After years of careful planning, hard decisions, and long hours, she had secured a deal that would place her company among the most respected in the region. Thomas, her trusted financial advisor, had played a significant role in guiding her through the complexities of the deal, ensuring her finances were protected and her position strengthened. Their dinner that evening was meant as a small celebration, a chance to relax after weeks of intense negotiations. The pair ordered wine and spoke with the ease of two people who respected each other's skills. Rebecca laughed occasionally while Thomas remained calm, listening carefully and responding in measured tones. The candlelight on their table flickered gently, giving the moment a sense of quiet satisfaction. Around them, other diners hardly noticed, believing it to be just another dinner in the bustling restaurant. Yet seated only a few tables away, someone was watching closely, turning what should have been a night of success into the prelude of tragedy. At first, the evening carried on without disturbance. Plates clattered in the kitchen, the band played a soothing tune, and waiters moved gracefully from table to table. Yet amid the flow of chatter and laughter, there was one man who seemed out of step with the rest of the crowd. His name, later revealed, was Daniel Reed. He sat alone, hunched slightly in his chair, his posture tight, as though every muscle in his body resisted relaxation. While others enjoyed their meals, his plate remained largely untouched. His fork scraped against the dish in small, distracted movements, but his eyes were not on his food. They were locked on Thomas and Rebecca. Daniel's gaze was sharp and unrelenting. To an outsider, it might have looked like idle curiosity, but the longer he stared, the more unsettling his presence became. He sipped his drink in slow, deliberate motions, never letting his attention waver. Guests nearby noticed him, but quickly dismissed the unease. In a crowded restaurant, strange behavior could be brushed off as nerves, loneliness, or even an awkward date gone wrong. Few people wanted to assume the worst. The staff, however, began to sense something peculiar. A waitress passing his table noted that he had barely spoken a word since being seated. He avoided eye contact with her, offering curt nods instead of thanks. His movements were restless, tapping fingers, shifting legs, a constant unease radiating from his corner of the room. Still, no one intervened. In the soft light of the Riverside Grill, surrounded by music and laughter, it was easier to believe he was harmless. But beneath that quiet surface, Daniel's intentions were darker than anyone could imagine, just as the night seemed to reach its peak of comfort with waiters delivering steaming plates of food and the band sliding into another mellow tune. The atmosphere inside the Riverside Grill suddenly changed. At 8:45, the soft glow of the chandeliers above began to tremble, flickering once, then again before plunging the restaurant into complete darkness. A collective gasp spread across the room, followed by the uneasy shuffle of chairs, as diners reached for their phones or tried to steady their drinks. For a brief, breathless moment, the room held nothing but silence, broken only by the faint clinking of cutlery and the startled whispers of confused guests. Children whimpered as their parents pulled them close. Couples leaned into each other, using the dim glow from phones to illuminate their tables. A few laughed nervously, brushing it off as a temporary outage. The staff moved quickly, their voices calm as they reassured guests that a backup system would restore the lights. And within seconds it did. Small emergency lamps clicked on, flooding the room in a faint yellow glow. The familiar comfort of the restaurant was replaced with something entirely different. An eerie, unfamiliar setting that cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. The music had stopped. The chatter had died. Instead of joy, an unshakable tension hung in the air. It was as if the building itself had taken a sharp breath, waiting for something to happen. Guests squinted across the dimly lit room, and though relief spread that the darkness hadn't lasted long, the unsettling silence that followed felt heavier than before. In that uneasy stillness, the first thread of terror began to unravel. The dim yellow light gave the restaurant a strange, dreamlike quality, but the unease that had settled over the room soon turned into sheer horror. It happened without warning. Out of the shadows, Daniel Reed pushed back his chair, the sudden scrape of wood against the floor cutting through the silence like a blade. Before anyone could process the sound, he rose to his feet and began moving quickly toward the window table where Thomas and Rebecca sat. His steps were determined, his movements sharp as if rehearsed. For a fraction of a second, people assumed he might be heading to the exit. But then, with one swift motion, he revealed the glint of a knife. A scream pierced the air as Daniel lunged forward. The blade drove downward in a frenzy, striking Thomas again and again with shocking speed. The white tablecloth was instantly soaked in red, the wine glasses shattering as they were knocked aside in the chaos. Rebecca pushed against Daniel with desperate strength, but he was relentless, each strike more brutal than the last. Chairs toppled, dishes crashed to the floor, and panic erupted around them. Guests scrambled from their tables, overturning plates and glasses as they tried to flee. The live band abandoned their instruments, rushing for safety. Waiters shouted warnings, guiding terrified families toward the exits. But Daniel seemed deaf to the noise, blind to the chaos. His entire focus was fixed on Thomas, his attacks unyielding, his face twisted in a cold, unreadable fury. Within moments, the joyous restaurant had transformed into a scene of carnage. In plain view of everyone, the celebration turned into a nightmare none would ever forget. The chaos inside the Riverside Grill was overwhelming. Diners pushed against each other in a frantic attempt to escape, their screams blending into a deafening roar. Plates shattered, chairs toppled, and the sound of hurried footsteps thundered across the floor. Yet in the middle of it all, Daniel Reed suddenly stopped. The knife, dripping and slick, slipped from his grasp and clattered against the tiles. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply lowered himself back into the chair he had abandoned moments earlier and folded his hands in his lap, his breathing steady, his expression eerily calm. The staff acted quickly. The manager, his hands shaking, shouted for the doors to be locked to prevent Daniel from leaving. Waiters guided trembling guests into corners, urging them to remain low and stay quiet. Rebecca, her dress stained with blood, cried out for help beside Thomas's motionless body, her sobs echoing through the half-lit room. Several patrons rushed to her side, but it was clear from the first glance that Thomas could not be saved. Within minutes, the sound of police sirens grew louder, their flashing lights visible through the large glass windows. Officers stormed inside, weapons drawn, prepared for resistance. What they found instead was chilling. Daniel seated quietly, his head tilted as though he had simply been waiting for them. He did not argue when handcuffs were placed on his wrists. He did not look at Rebecca or the other guests. He offered no words, no excuses, not even a flicker of regret as he was led away, past the terrified faces of those who had witnessed the attack. The room remained frozen in disbelief. A celebration had ended in blood, and the killer had surrendered without a fight. When detectives began piecing together the story behind the attack, what initially looked like an act of random violence quickly revealed a darker, more calculated motive. Daniel Reed was not a stranger who had wandered into the Riverside Grill by chance. His life had once been deeply entangled with Rebecca's, and their history explained the rage that had exploded in front of so many witnesses. Years earlier, Daniel and Rebecca had been business partners. Together, they had built a promising company from the ground up, investing their time, money, and energy into a vision they believed would make them both successful. For a while it worked. The company grew and profits increased. But as the years passed, disagreements sharpened and trust between them fractured. Rebecca, ambitious and determined, made choices Daniel opposed. Tensions escalated until their partnership dissolved in a bitter legal battle. Rebecca emerged victorious, gaining full control of the company. Daniel, meanwhile, was forced out with nothing but resentment and a ruined reputation. His career crumbled and friends distanced themselves from the controversy. For Daniel, life never returned to stability. Over the years, his bitterness turned into obsession. He followed Rebecca's success from afar, watching as she expanded her company and earned respect in circles that once dismissed him. When he learned of her growing relationship with Thomas Gray, the financial advisor who had helped her secure her biggest achievement yet, something inside him snapped. In his mind, Thomas was not just her advisor, but the symbol of everything Daniel had lost. To him, the dinner was not a celebration of business triumph, but a stage on which to enact his revenge. That night, in front of strangers, he chose to destroy what he could not reclaim. The trial of Daniel Reed quickly became one of the most talked about cases in the city's history. From the very first day, crowds gathered outside the courthouse, desperate to catch a glimpse of the man who had turned a celebrated evening into a public nightmare. Reporters filled the courtroom, their pens scratching furiously as every detail was recounted. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, a mixture of curiosity, anger, and grief. Rebecca Mills sat at the front, her face pale but resolute, determined to see justice for the man whose life had been stolen in front of her eyes. Prosecutors painted Daniel as a calculated killer. They described how he had entered the Riverside Grill armed with a weapon, watched his victims closely, and waited for the right moment to strike. Witnesses were called to the stand, diners who had screamed as the attack unfolded, waiters who had seen him, sitting in silence, and staff who had locked the doors while he calmly sat after the murder. Their testimonies were chilling, bringing back the chaos of that night in vivid detail. The defense, however, argued that Daniel had suffered years of mental decline. They spoke of betrayal, financial ruin, and a mind collapsing under the weight of obsession. They pleaded for understanding, suggesting his actions were driven less by cruelty and more by brokenness. Yet photographs of the blood-stained tablecloth and autopsy reports left little room for doubt. After weeks of arguments, the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, the judge sentenced Daniel Reed to life in prison without parole. The decision was met with relief, but also a somber silence. Justice had been served, yet the memory of the crime lingered heavier than any sentence could. Months passed before the Riverside Grill reopened its doors. Fresh paint covered the walls. New furniture replaced what had been broken, and the management hoped to restore the atmosphere of comfort and elegance. Yet for those who had been there on that fateful night, the memory could not be erased by renovations. Many former patrons refused to return, saying the moment they thought of the restaurant, they could still hear the sudden screams, see the flicker of failing lights, and feel the weight of fear pressing in as chaos unfolded. The restaurant had been a place of joy, but now it carried a shadow that time struggled to lift. Rebecca Mills attempted to continue her life and business, but the events haunted her. Every meeting in a public place carried a sense of unease. She lived with constant reminders of what she had witnessed. The sight of Thomas Gray collapsing beside her, the feel of his blood staining her hands, the sound of the crowd panicking around her. Success brought her no peace. In interviews years later, she admitted that the attack had left scars no courtroom verdict could heal. For the wider community, the Riverside murder became a grim reminder that violence could strike anywhere, even in spaces meant for celebration. Newspapers and documentaries dissected every detail, turning the night into a cautionary tale about obsession, revenge, and the fragility of safety. The case was retold so often that it took on the weight of urban legend, whispered in conversations long after. Though the restaurant survived and new customers eventually filled its tables, those who remembered that night carried the story with them always. The Riverside Grill was never just a restaurant again. It was a place forever marked by tragedy.